Yes, Rangada.
Okay. So, who will read the last para, the symbolic companionship?
Symbolic companionship.
Shall I read?
Shall I read?
Yes, why not?
Oh
Okay.
my God. I think my background voice is too much. No, it's coming. Something.
No, we can hear you.
Okay. Shall I?
Yes, yes,
Yes,
do.
please.
The symbolic companionship of Arjuna and Krishna, the human and the divine soul, is expressed elsewhere in Indian thought. In the heavenward, in the heavenward journey of Indra and Kutsa, seated in one chariot, in the figure of the two birds upon one tree, in the Upanishads, in the twin figures of Nara Narayana, the seers who do tapasya together for the knowledge. But in all three, it is the idea of the divine knowledge in which, as the Gita says, all action culminates, that it is in view. Here it is instead the action which leads to that knowledge and in which the divine knower figures himself. Arjuna and Krishna, this human and this divine stand together, not as the seers in the peaceful hermitage of meditation, but as fighter and holder of the reins in the clamorous field, in the midst of the hurtling shaft in the chariot of battle. The teacher of the Gita is therefore not only the God in man who unveils himself in the world of knowledge, but the God in man who moves our whole world of action, by and for whom all our humanity exists and struggles and labors, towards whom all human life travels and progresses. He is the secret master of works and sacrifice and the friend of the human peoples.
Yeah. So, this is the basically what he's saying is that everything is divine. Even the lowest level also is essentially divine. Essentially. There is a covering, but essence is always divine. Okay, so human beings can become divine. This idea is there very much in the Advaita philosophy. It is not there so much in the others. They make a difference between the human being and the divine. They make a difference. The human being can never become divine. He can have a relation with the divine, but he can't become divine. That would be blasphemy. How can a human being who is imperfect become the divine? But here in this paragraph, very clearly, and in three places, the Indian philosophy says that every human being is essentially divine and can become divine. So we'll discuss those three images that he is giving. Okay. So, this is basically the idea that man is essentially divine. He is plunged himself into the opposite of the divine. He has come into the undivine world, apparently, and he is finding himself back and he can become divine. Okay. Now, the symbolic companionship of Arjuna and Krishna. So, what is the symbol? Essentially, Arjuna and Krishna are the same. One is a human soul and the other is a divine soul. Okay, so, this is the same. Just like the collectivity and the individuality. The collective, the universal soul is God, but he divides himself into 100,000 million souls and he is going on finding himself back through all these souls. He plunges himself into the opposite and he is finding himself back again. He is enjoying the game. So, this is the essential. So, Arjuna is a human soul and Krishna is a divine soul. Is expressed elsewhere in Indian thought in the heavenward journey of Indra and Kutsa, seated in one chariot. This is in the Rig Veda. Okay, um, this is the Rig Veda where Kutsa is a human soul and Indra is a god, and they are traveling in a chariot together. That also is very symbolic. The chariot is the body, mind, life, or at a universal level, matter, life, mind. That's a chariot. You are coming into that chariot, and the human soul is also plunged into the body, mind, life, and that's a chariot. And he is traveling. The travel is through many, many lives. He is becoming more and more divine, more and more divine. He is evolving. So it's a journey. This idea of the journey is there also in the Vedas. Okay, so it's a journey. And at the end of the journey, Indra and Kutsa is a human being, but he becomes absolutely like Indra. And no one can make out the difference between them except Indra's wife, because she is Shachi. She is the one who understands that, oh, this Kutsa also has become almost like Arjuna. Sorry, Indra. Yeah, Indra. Okay, that's one image. Then the other image is the figure of the two birds upon one tree in the Upanishad. Okay, in the Upanishad it says that the soul can take two stations. Okay, one, the human soul in the body is in ignorance, and he is sitting on a lower branch of the tree. The tree is the universe, and the lower branch represents matter, life, and mind. But there is a higher bird, there is a higher branch on which the same bird is sitting, and the one who is sitting on top is without any sorrow, but the one who is below is in sorrow. This image of the two birds is there in several Upanishads, not only one Upanishad, but it is there in several Upanishads. Okay, so the same soul, when it is in the lower branch, that is the body, mind, life, it suffers. Okay, it eats the fruit of the tree and suffers. But the one who is sitting on top can eat the fruit of the tree. He can live in the physical world, but he does not suffer. He is in that's the same soul. So that's the other image of the human being becoming divine. And then there's the third, okay, the Nara and the Narayana. Nara and Narayana, the first part is the same, Nara and Narayana. Nara is a human being, Narayana is the divine. They are also, so there are three images being given here in Indian philosophy and Indian practice, where the human soul is essentially divine. So this is the whole symbol of Arjuna and Krishna. And they are sitting in the same chariot, remember. And he is only guiding. Krishna is not fighting. He is only guiding. He is guiding the chariot and giving him guidance. So the divine is there within us, guiding us. Whether we get the guidance or not depends on how much we have progressed through other lives. Okay, so. But in all three, it is the idea of the divine knowledge, in which, as the Gita says, all action culminates, that is in view. All the human action, whenever, even if it is any imperfect, each action is slowly revealing to us the true knowledge. Because we gain experience. In the physical world, when we are acting, we make mistakes and we learn from mistakes what is the right action. And so through many, many lives, not only one life, but slowly we recover the true knowledge and we can become divine in essence. That's what he's saying. So he's again quoting from the Gita about the all action culminates in knowledge. This is chapter 4 of the Gita, verse 33. Sarvam karmakhilam partha jnane parisamapyate. All action ultimately ends in knowledge. Okay? That's from the Gita. So Arjuna is the one who is engaged in action, and finally, through many, many lives, he can become Krishna. Arjuna and Krishna, this human and this divine, stand together not as seers in the peaceful hermitage of meditation, but as fighter and holder of the reins in the clamorous field, in the midst of the hurtling shafts in the chariot of battle. So what he's saying is, the Mayavadin and the Buddhists, they are just escaping from the physical world into a peaceful hermitage of meditation. But the Gita is saying, no, come down to the physical world, be in the middle of the battle, face the problems, hurtling shafts, the arrows are coming, The world is full of dualities and you will learn from them. So, and then you will become ultimately one. So the Gita is very clearly recommending action in the physical world. That is the reason why it is also a exponent of Karma Yoga. It is not only an exponent of Jnana Yoga, it even tells you how to sit and on what to sit. Okay, it goes so far. It says you must sit not on the ground and not too high. You must sit on a place which is medium. Then you spread a kusha grass. Kusha grass is you have to be comfortable. You should not have an uncomfortable position, otherwise you can't meditate. So it goes and then says it keeps your spine absolutely erect and then meditate, and that also in the middle of your eyebrow. So very clear practical instructions on how to do it. But it is also an exponent of Bhakti Yoga as well as Karma Yoga. It is not only meditation. Shreyendra is using the word peaceful hermitage of meditation. It's a symbol he is using. They don't want to have peace and get away from the physical world, but you have to be in the world and fight and learn. Okay, clamorous field. It reminds me of many people used to write to Sir, sir, we want to, in the early days, we want to do yoga and we want to come to your ashram. So he would send a, what is your aim of yoga? There are so many aims in yoga. You want liberation, you want power, you want this, you want that. What is your aim? So they would say, we want peace and calm and liberation. Then he would say, that's not my yoga. My yoga is remain in the physical world, face all the problems, no peace, until you reach a certain level of consciousness where there is peace, but that peace is permanent. Okay, so no escaping from the physical world. So that's exactly what he's saying here. Okay, there are some who want only peace, but there are some who come down into the physical world, get the opposition and become master of the opposition. Naturally, that's better because the first are only escaping the problem, but the second are facing the problem and becoming master of them. Okay. Now, I go to the last sentence. The teacher of the Gita is therefore not only the God in man, okay, who unveils himself in the world of knowledge, but the God in man who moves our whole world of action, by and for whom all our humanity exists and struggles and labors, towards whom all human life travels and progresses. He is the secret master of works and sacrifice and the friend of all peoples. Involved in the idea here is that the divine can be transcendent and he can also be in the human being, personal, but he can also be in the cosmos. So that's the implication. If you read that carefully, you will see that. No? The teacher of the Gita is therefore not only the God in man, that's the individual. The divine is there in all human beings, who unveils himself in the world of knowledge. Okay? He is there in the universe through action. But the God in man who moves our whole world of action. He is there in the cosmic, by and for whom all our humanity exists and struggles and labors, towards whom all human life travels and progresses. He is a secret.
Why does he say human life, not the animal life, not the plant life?
Because God is most apparent in the human life. No? He is there, but he is also saying whole world of action. Yeah? He is also saying whole world of action. No? God in man, who moves our whole world of action, by and for whom all humanity exists and struggles and labors, is the Gita is symbolic of God's guidance to man. That's why he's talking of that. He's not saying that God doesn't exist in apart from man. He doesn't say that. He's just concentrating on one aspect of the Gita. He's commenting on the Gita, so he's not going elsewhere. Okay, that's why. Okay, so that is the. So he has dealt with the divine teacher. Now,
human peoples, why it is plural, Rangada?
Which one?
Last two human peoples.
Okay, when the word people is used in the plural, it means nations.
Okay.
it means all humanity. That way, okay? The human peoples. When you use the plural, it means nations. Okay? That means entire humanity. He's not there only in
India.
one country. Yeah, I didn't say India, any one country, but he can be there everywhere. Okay. So we now come to the next one. So he has dealt with the divine. In other words, the divine is there helping mankind and guiding. Okay. And man is essentially divine. Now he comes to the human disciple, Arjuna. And he represents the human soul who is ready for a spiritual life. He is not a normal human being, nor is he a realized human being. Arjuna is the human soul who is normal in ignorance, but he is ready for spiritual life. That's why he is given guidance. That he is the symbol of that. So we start reading the next one.
Yes.
Pallu, you'll read?
Okay, Rangada.
Yeah, go ahead.
Such then is the divine teacher of the Gita, the eternal avatar, the divine who has descended into the human consciousness, the Lord seated within the heart of all beings, he who guides from behind the veil all our thought and action and heart seeking, even as he directs from behind the veil of visible and sensible forms and forces and tendencies, sensible forms and forces and tendencies, the great universal action of the world, which he has manifested in his own being. All the strife of our upward endeavor and seeking finds its culmination and ceases in a satisfied fulfillment when we can rend the veil and get behind our apparent self to this real self, can realize our whole being in this true Lord of our being, can give up our personality to and into this one real person, merge our ever dispersed and ever converging mental activities into his plenary light, offer up our errant and struggling will and energies into his vast, luminous, and undivided will, at once renounce and satisfy all our dissipated, outward moving desires and emotions in the plenitude of his self-existent bliss. This is the world teacher of whose eternal knowledge all other highest teaching is but the variation, reflection, and partial word. This is the voice to which the hearing of our soul has to awaken.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see what he's saying. In fact, what he's doing in the first para, he always, that's his style. The first para, he always summarizes what he said earlier. Okay. He is actually summarizing whatever he said earlier about the divine teacher. And usually in the last paragraph, he gives you a hint of what he's going to say in the next chapter. That's his style. Okay. So here he is summarizing. Let's see what he's saying. Okay. Such then. So obviously, whatever I've said, therefore, that's the implication. Whatever I've said earlier, such then is the divine teacher of the Gita, the eternal avatar, the divine who has descended into the human consciousness. Because there is a divine who has not descended into the human consciousness, he is the transcendent. But in the Gita, it is Krishna, so avatar. So therefore, he is symbolic of the divine in the cosmos as well as in the individual. Okay, so who has descended into the human consciousness. Why is he spending time saying this? The divine who has descended into the human consciousness, because there is a divine who has not descended into the human consciousness. That's a transcendent. That's why he's saying that. Okay. The Lord seated within the heart of all beings. This is the, again and again he uses this, chapter 18 of the Gita, verse 61. And it goes like this. It is one of the most well-known expressions in the Gita. Ishvara sarva bhutanam hriddeshe Arjuna tishtati brahmayan sarva bhutani yantrarudhani mayaya. So he is there in the heart of everybody. Oh Arjuna, he is there everywhere. And he is making the body-mind life move like a machine. Okay. Yantra Rudhani. Okay. And how is he doing that? By the power of his Maya. Okay. That's what he's saying. So, who is the Lord seated within the heart of all beings? He who guides from behind the veil. Which is the veil? He's telling you. All our thought and action and the heart seeking. Even as he directs from behind the veil of visible and sensible forms and forces and tendencies, the great universal action of the world, which he has manifested in his own being. Okay, so there is nothing else except the divine. Even when he's manifesting something out of himself, it is only into himself. The universe also is only the divine. Okay? That's the implication. Out of himself, into himself, in his own being. So we'll look at that a little. He who guides from behind the veil. Which is the veil? He is telling you very clearly. Thought, action, and heart. Thought is the mind, and action is the body, and the heart is your emotional part. So, in other words, mind, life, body. That's a veil. Even as he directs from behind the veil of visible and sensible forms. So another veil is in the universe. All the forms that you see in the universe, whatever form you see, are also veils. Okay? So there are your own veils are there, body, mind, life, but there are also veils in the universe. Every form that you see is a veil. And this can take many. It is not only physical forms, but it can also be forces. It can also be tendencies. The great universal action of the world, which he has manifested in his own being. All the strife of our upward endeavor and seeking finds its culmination and ceases in a satisfied fulfillment. Note the word satisfied fulfillment, because ultimately you realize that all your sufferings and all your journey in the upward endeavor and finding is finally satisfied, and you realize that all the suffering that you went through is justified, because you are trying for something very difficult, not something very easy. And when you try for something difficult, you have to undergo difficulties. Okay? There you have to undergo all the suffering. And that is in other places he says something very interesting. He says the suffering in the physical world is the price you pay for purchasing perfection. In fact, he uses the word ransom also sometimes. Okay, the suffering that you have in the physical world is the price you are paying to get what? Peace, knowledge, ananda. So you have to go through the suffering to get that. Okay, it's very interesting. And in the Christian theology, they say that you can't go to the divine without suffering. So there's a very interesting movie, Saint Bernadette. Okay, if you see that, there is one nun who is constantly challenging Bernadette and saying, "You have not suffered. How can you realize God?" Because she's saying Mother Mary, she is having vision of Mother Mary. Okay, and this nun, elderly nun, is saying, "I don't believe that you have seen the divine, because you can't see the divine without suffering, and you are not suffering at all." Because she was a very, very open person, and she had devotion. And so she did not, the path of psychic being, there is no suffering. Even when suffering comes, you take it as coming from the Lord, and you don't suffer like other people would. So this suffering is something which gets justified. That's why he's using the word satisfied fulfillment. Of course, Srimad says that you don't need to suffer. But suffering, if it comes, bear it. Okay, it is very interesting. In one correspondence, someone is saying, okay, if difficulties come, it means that I am traveling. Because if difficulties don't come, it means that I am not traveling, I am not making any effort. So therefore, maybe I should invite the difficulties. And Srimad replies, no need to do that. They will come by themselves. You don't need to invite difficulties. That's a wrong attitude. Yeah, very funny.
My God.
No, the idea is you take it a little further, na? That's the whole thing. Why do even in India, why do the people lie on a bed of nails, okay, and do fasting, and they in the Islam they whip themselves, okay, and in Christianity also they undergo austerities. So this is not the way of the Gita. You don't need to do. You don't need to invite difficulties and put sufferings on yourself. It will come by itself. So that is what. So divine, and it gets. I'm saying all this because ultimately it is satisfied fulfillment. You realize that all the suffering that you went through is justified because it's a very difficult journey and it was not something cruelly being put on you, the suffering. It is justified. Finally, you get full satisfaction. When do you get that? When you rend the veil and get behind the apparent self to the real self. The apparent self is our body, mind, life. We all identify ourselves with our apparent self. And real self is your soul or your self, your psychic being or yourself. Psychic being and self are two aspects of the real personality. The psychic being comes down to the physical world. The self does not come down to the physical world, remains up, but it is your own individual self. And can realize our whole being in this true Lord of our being, can give up our personality to and into this one real person. Note the two words, personality with a lowercase means body, mind, life. And into this real person with a P cap, okay, that's a soul. Or the real person is a psychic being. Or the self. One of the two. Okay, so remember this. Remember, always use the word personality to mean your apparent being, okay, your body, mind, life, and the person with a P cap. Sometimes he doesn't use P cap, but it's a word when he uses person, it means a true individual, okay, and merge in our ever dispersed and ever converging mental activities. Ever dispersed, the normal condition of human beings. Our thoughts are wandering here and there and all. Even when I'm trying to concentrate on what is happening, thoughts will come. Oh, what do I have to do today? I have to do this. Oh, I have got an appointment with somebody else. Oh, what is there for dinner today? All this ever dispersed. The mind is constantly interrupted by all sorts of random ideas. But when it starts doing yoga, it's ever converging. Okay, it's going towards one concentration, mental activities into his plenary light. Plenary, the word means full, like in French, plein. Okay, plenary light. Offer up our errant and struggling. Errant, full of error and also wandering. Okay, struggle, will and energies into his vast, luminous and undivided will. At our level, our will is always divided. Partly we want the divine, partly we want pleasure, partly we want this, partly we want that. It's undivided. But the yogi who tries to concentrate his will only on one thing, finally he reaches the undivided will. At once renounce and satisfy all our dissipated, outward moving desires and emotions. Now, very interesting words. Dissipated, outward moving desires. That is very obvious. Even our desires are dissipated. They are not intensely focused. Okay? And outward moving. Something always in the physical world we want. Okay? Outward moving and dissipated. But renounce and satisfy. There is an echo of the Isha Upanishad, the first verse itself. Tena taktena bhunjita. Enjoy by renouncing. It sounds funny, na? We normally enjoy when we get something, okay? But you have to renounce the desire and get satisfaction. Renounce and satisfy, okay? Our dissipated and emotions. This is very clearly renounce and satisfy is the reference to the Isha Upanishad. Tena tyaktena, give up that, okay, and enjoy. And all our dissipated and outward moving desires and emotions. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, okay, there's a which can be very often misinterpreted. It says, conquer your enemy and enjoy a royal kingdom. That's also there. So enjoyment is not, it's a right of the human being, okay? But this is misinterpreted. The lower enjoyment is what is interpreted, but no, there is a higher enjoyment also is there, which is absolutely pure and without any cause. So this is the world teacher, of whose eternal knowledge all other highest teaching is but the various reflection and partial word. This is the voice to which the hearing of our soul has to awaken. And what is that? Work in the world. Don't run away from the world. That is the ultimate knowledge that you have. Okay, so now we can go to the next one. So here he has actually given you the gist of what he said earlier. All your suffering in the physical world is justified when you concentrate and lose your identification with your apparent self, which is the body, mind, life, and get to your psychic being or the self. Renounce desire and get satisfaction. That's a price you pay. Okay, so we go to the next one. Arjuna, the disciple.
I will read.
Okay, yes, Sunki.
Yes.
Arjuna.
Arjuna, the disciple who receives his initiation on the battlefield, is a counterpart of this conception. He is the type of the struggling human soul who has not yet received the knowledge, but has grown fit to receive it by action in the world, in a close companionship and an increasing nearness to the higher and divine self in humanity. There is a method of explaining the Gita in which not only this episode, but the whole Mahabharata is turned into an allegory of the inner life, and has nothing to do with our outward human life and action, but only with the battles of the soul and the powers of the strife within us for possession. That is a view which a general character and the actual language of the episode does not justify, and, if pressed, would turn the straightforward philosophical language of the Gita into a constant, laborious, and somewhat puerile mystification. The language of the Veda and part, at least of the Puranas, is plainly symbolic, full of figures and concrete representations of things that lie behind the veil. But the Gita is written in plain terms and professes to solve the great ethical and spiritual difficulties which the life of man raises, and it will not do to go behind this plain language and thought and wrest them to the service of our fancy. But there is this much of truth in the view that the setting of the doctrine, though not symbolical, is certainly typical, as indeed the setting of such a discourse as the Gita must necessarily be, if it is to have any relation at all with that which it frames. Arjuna, as we have seen, is the representative man of a great world struggle and divinely guided movement of men and nations. In the Gita, he typifies the human soul of action, brought face to face through that action in its highest and most violent crisis with the problems of human life and its apparent incompatibility with the spiritual state, even with the purely ethical ideal of perfection.
Yeah. Okay, so basically what he's saying in this para, we'll discuss it, but he's saying basically that don't think that the Gita is something very only symbolic and theoretical. It is absolutely, it guides you for physical action in the physical world. That is the reason why in India nowadays, in many institutions of management, okay, there are so many institutions, several institutions of management, they teach you the Gita, how to deal with physical action and physical world relations of how to behave. Okay, this is a very important thing. It actually began with in Jamshedpur. In Jamshedpur, they have the Tata Steel plant, na? So they have also a management course there. And in that management course, they used to teach our that book, Dalal's book, okay? Living within. So how to deal with physical action. But now Gita also is very often given. You will see it's not at all uncommon that the top executives in many companies, okay, they know the Gita. They have read the Gita. How are you going to deal with difficulty in the business world if you don't know how to deal with your staff, if you don't know how to deal with human beings, how to conduct yourself? So that is, it is something very, very practical. That's what Swami is saying. He's saying that the Veda and the Puranas and all that symbolic. Okay, fine. And they are representation of things that lie behind the veil. But in the Gita, it is not behind the veil. It's right in the middle of the battle of life. It is something that guides you in life itself. That's basically what he's saying here. Okay. So we have about 7-8 minutes. So we'll quickly go through the paragraph, each sentence. Okay? So the message is very clear. Gita is not a gospel for escaping from the physical world. It's a gospel for how to deal with action in the physical world. That's what he's saying very clearly. Arjuna, the disciple who receives his initiation. Okay? The word is pronounced initiation. Okay? Not initiation, it is initiation. Okay. On the battlefield is the counterpart of this conception. Okay. There is a conception that you have to escape from the physical world. No, it is not that. The disciple who receives the initiation on the bed is a counterpart of this conception. Okay. He is the type of this struggling human soul who has not yet received the knowledge but has grown fit to receive it by action in the world in a close companionship and increasing nearness to the higher and divine self in humanity. So this is he is an ordinary human being, but he is ready for a spiritual life. Many ordinary human beings are not ready for a spiritual life, but he is. So that the Gita is giving advice to such people who are ready for a spiritual life. There is a method of explaining the Gita in which not only this episode, but the whole Mahabharata is turned into an allegory of the inner life and has nothing to do with our outward human life and action, but only with the battles of the soul and the powers that strive within for possession. In other words, it's a psychological representation. It is great, even if it's a psychological representation, it is great, but it is much more than that. It is a guide for actual physical action in the world. Okay? So, that strive within for possession. That is a view which the general character of the actual language of the epic do not justify, and if pressed, would turn the straightforward philosophical language of the Gita into a constant, laborious and somewhat puerile mystification. The word puerile means childish, immature, okay? Somewhat puerile mystification. It is not that, it is something very, very practical. The language of the Veda and part at least of the Puranas is plainly symbolic. It is symbolic and psychological. It represents full of figures and concrete representation of things that lie behind the veil. But the Gita is teaching you something which is in front of the veil, not behind the veil. Okay, that's what it's saying. But the Gita is written in plain terms and claims to. Profess, the word profess means to claim. Okay, to solve the great ethical and spiritual difficulties which the life of man raises. Not the word ethical, even moral questions it is dealing with. Okay, and raises, and it will not do to go behind this plain language and thought and wrest them to the surface of our fancy. The word wrest means forcibly pull and extract some meaning which is not intended for that. Okay? Take power and control over a struggle. The word wrest with a W-R-E-S-T means forcibly pull from another. Take away. If you have got something, Yeah, if you have got something, somebody else comes and wrests it from you, snatches it from you. So you can't misinterpret the Gita and say and give some other meaning to it. That's what he's saying. Okay. The meaning of the Gita is very clear. Action in the physical world, not only symbolism. But there is this much of truth in the view that the setting of the doctrine, though not symbolical, is certainly typical, as indeed the setting of such a discourse as the Gita must necessarily be, if it is to have any relation at all with that which it frames. So it is symbolic, but don't take it only as symbol. That's what he's saying. Arjuna, as we have seen, is a representative man of a great world struggle and divinely guided movement of men and nations. Now note, he is using the word nations here, not peoples. In the Gita, he typifies the human soul of action, brought face to face to that action in its highest and most violent crisis with the problem of human life and its apparent incompatibility with the spiritual state, or even with a purely ethical ideal of perfection. So it guides you in the physical world. The guidance that comes from morality is not the actual guidance. The Gita will tell you how to deal with the action in the physical world in the real way. That's what it's saying. Okay? So today we stop here. Now we have got only 2 minutes left. So basically, what he's saying, don't take the Gita as theoretical. It is absolutely practical knowledge. It gives you great guidance in the physical world. Okay?
Okay, Rangada. Bonne journée.
Bonjour.
Merci.
Yeah.
Merci
Merci.
beaucoup. Joyeux Noël.